All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for July's Webinar Wednesday with PKD Foundation Chief Scientific Officer, Dr. David Barron. We are excited to be back after being gone last month to put on our national convention. And I want to do a little sound check and make sure if you can hear me and hear me clearly, can you send me a message in your Q&A, your chat box, so that I know we're doing okay? Because I'm not sure if you can hear me. Oh, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Okay, awesome. We're good. All right, so during the presentation, as you all have discovered, you have a little box there, and you can type your comments and your questions in there, and we will have a Q&A at the end, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Note that at the PKD Foundation, we do not offer medical advice, and the information shared this afternoon isn't intended to be a substitute for a consultation with your health professional. Care and treatment decisions related to your health must be made in consultation with your doctor. I am recording this webinar, and we'll be archiving it on our website within the next few days. Today, David will be taking a look at the clinical study process and kind of taking a deeper dive into the design and enrollment portions. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to focus in on clinical study processes that drug companies use to bring new therapies to the market. I'm familiar with this through the decades that I worked in pharmaceutical companies. And even though I'm a non-clinical scientist, I was often part of the design of clinical trials and consulted when unusual findings, such as adverse effects, came up in such trials. So I do bring some experience to this aspect of drug development. So start off with a little cartoon, and it really gets to the point of the fact that everybody likes the notion of clinical trials because it means that there may be a drug for a disease that's an issue for either themselves or their families. And so I've substituted whatever word was under ARPKD in the cartoon, but it points to the fact that while many people are excited for somebody else to be in clinical trials, they often are nervous or have some sort of an excuse not to participate in the trial themselves. And I'd like to say that that decision ultimately is yours personally to make, but that there are a lot of advantages to being in these studies, not only for yourself, but for all of those that have a disease similar to yours. So clinical drug development typically begins with the first dose in a human subject. And for common diseases like arthritis or diabetes, where there are many millions of patients, these first dose studies are generally done in volunteers. So college campuses are a favorite recruiting area for drug companies because college is expensive and students are more than willing to volunteer for these studies because they usually pay, and that's incentive enough to volunteer. Also, first dose studies start at very low doses that, except in very rare circumstances, are generally safe. So these first dose in human studies, called phase 1 studies, may end at any time, and this applies to virtually any clinical trial, actually. Whenever it's clear to the investigators that the risk is exceeding the benefit of a particular drug, that's likely to mean the end of that drug's development. Often drugs which work well in rats or mice don't work well in humans, and that's a reason for canceling drug development. And then drugs take a long time to develop. Even after the last patient has been registered in a drug trial, if the drug trial lasts 6 months, you have to wait another 6 months for that last patient to finish his or her course of the drug. And then it goes to the FDA or EMA, which is the European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, or the Japanese Medicines Agency, or other regulatory agencies. Switzerland has their own, and so forth. And the process of review can often take a year or longer. However, clinical development doesn't end with approval of a drug. It often continues, and usually always continues, even after approval, to make sure that there are no adverse effects that are extremely rare that might not have been discovered during the actual clinical development. And then drug companies are also anxious to look for new indications for drugs. The label, which is all important in the drug industry and for the physicians that prescribe the drug, really tell how to use the drug and for what diseases. And drug companies would always like to see a label that covers more diseases and more patients. So what about clinical trials and use specifically? There are many variables here. You may want to participate, but you can't. And we'll get into this a little later, but all these clinical trials are done through instruction, and that instruction is the protocol. And the protocol is who's eligible for the trial, at what age, what weight, what disease you have, what disease you may not have, the stage of your disease, other comorbidities, which mean other diseases that aren't related to the disease that the drug is intended to treat, and you may be on other drugs that interfere with the experimental drugs. So don't be surprised if you enthusiastically enroll in a trial and you're told, unfortunately, that one of these issues may prevent your participation. You may want to participate but won't or can't because the study site is too far away, or the study interferes with lifestyle, and by that I mean your job, child care obligations, and so forth. And unfortunately for rare diseases, it's often the case that study sites will be far away. So that's a potential issue. And what if you may not want to participate but could? You may be put off by the frequency of visits, the requirement for overnight stays, invasive procedures like numerous blood draws or radiological imaging, and you may be told to adhere to a very specific diet that's not to your liking. I would say that many of these are more excuses than absolute reasons that you would not participate, and I would encourage you to think twice for some of these personal issues where you would otherwise be allowed into the study. But I want to stress that for all studies, ultimately the decision is yours and yours alone. So I showed this slide earlier last year about the whole path to development of drugs. I've outlined in yellow in the ellipse the clinical phase, and that's the phase 1 clinical trial. We just talked about that a bit. The phase 2 clinical trial and the phase 3 clinical trial. That's the pivotal trial that usually is what the regulatory agencies emphasize the most in reviewing whether a new candidate drug should be approved for marketing. And we'll talk about these stages in a little more detail. So, oh, I'm going backwards. Excuse me. So, I've shown this slide also. These are the clinical risks, and I've highlighted these in the blue boxes. You may take a drug, and there may be adverse reactions. And really, that's the whole point of a clinical trial. Not only do you want to see whether the drug is effective and treats the disease in question, but you also want to see if a drug causes adverse reactions. Now, these may not be a big issue if they're occurring at higher doses than are expected to be used. The FDA wants to know what happens at higher doses just in case someone takes too much drug by accident. Also, and this is what really is why drugs are often expensive, that the best drugs that are theoretically going to work very well, it turns out that you take the drug and it's very poorly absorbed. In other words, it doesn't get into your bloodstream and you don't have high enough levels in your body to actually treat the disease. And then some drugs, even if they do have the level in the blood that was expected, they turn out not to be very effective. And that, again, is what clinical trials are all about. And on the right side, side effects we've talked about. These could be as simple as a rash that goes away when you stop the drug. It may affect your sleep. It may affect your appetite, those types of things. And if those can't be figured out by the study directors, the drug may be withdrawn from the clinical trials, or they learn that a lower dose may be just as effective and avoid some of these side effects. Instability is another issue. If the drug that you take is only stable for a couple of weeks, you can't probably put that in your medicine cabinet for 6 months and expect the first pill that you take to be the same as the last pill you take. This is more of a manufacturing issue, but this can be found out during clinical trials as well. You may wonder why a clinical trial stops. Some of it has nothing to do with whether the drug is safe or effective. It may just be not stable enough to be a drug that can be marketed. So a typical drug in clinical development, it's never entirely smooth sailing. I've had experience with many drugs that have succeeded quite well, actually, but inevitably the protocol that your study defines may have settled on the wrong doses, so those have to be adjusted. There's actually an adaptive study design that has some advocates and some people who say once you design the protocol, you shouldn't change it. The FDA is more open to adaptive trial design, and therefore you can go back to the FDA and say we had the wrong dose range, we would like to change that. The FDA considers it and either approves or doesn't approve the change. And there may be unforeseen off-target or adverse effects. Off-target effects are sometimes interesting because they point to the fact that the drug may be useful for a disease that it's not even being currently studied for. So many successful drugs on the market have found their way to the market in clinical trials for something else, and they turn out to actually be effective for a disease that wasn't even considered. And then there are unanticipated dropout rates. For example, people on drug experience some sort of side effect that's not a safety issue per se, but it may mean that you go to the bathroom more often or that you wake up early in the morning and for whatever reason you don't tolerate the drug, and that makes it very difficult to study, obviously. And then you have the institutional review board, and I'll talk more about this, but virtually every study done at a medical institution has an institutional review board, and if they're looking at the data and they see a signal that might indicate that the drug is not safe, they may tell the principal investigator of the study to stop the trial, but not tell them why. They don't want to unblind the study, so the issue has to be worked out with the FDA, and the study will either begin again if the IRB's concerns are addressed, or the study may have to stop. And then there's the poor enrollment issue, and that's where the foundation and myself really encourage participation in studies, because often people just can't be persuaded to take the time to participate in a study. But later on I'll give you some good reasons on why it's generally a good choice, particularly in a disease like ADPKD and ARPKD, where there are no current drugs specifically for the treatment of those diseases in the United States. Studies are often held up by regulatory concerns. It's not only the IRB that may have an issue, the FDA may have an issue. This results in clinical holds, and the company scrambles to figure out if the issues involved can be resolved to the FDA and the IRB's satisfaction, or again, it may result in the end of clinical trials for that drug. And this just emphasizes the point that getting a drug to market is not the easiest task in the world. So with a good drug, the reward is that it's efficacious, it treats the disease it was intended to treat, it's safe. I'm saying, remember Paracelsus, he was the first toxicologist, and his admonition to everybody is that all drugs or substances, including water, can be toxic. It's just a matter of dose. And that gets to the benefit risk. In other words, one would like to see a benefit that is well below the dose that indicates a risk. And also good to have is ease of dosing. So that means a small tablet that you can take once a day, not 4 times a day. And that means that the drug has an appropriate duration of action. In other words, you take it in the morning and it's still effective at night until you take the next pill the next morning. Obviously that it's tolerable. In other words, you're not calling your doctor saying, I don't feel so well, I think it's this new drug I took. And this is increasingly important, that it has minimal interaction with other drugs or your diet. Drugs are metabolized by your body just like food is metabolized by your body. This is generally done in the liver, but it can also happen in the intestines and the kidney. And one drug can interfere with the metabolism of another drug. And you'll often find that your doctor will tell you, don't drink grapefruit juice when you take a drug like simvastatin to lower your cholesterol, because grapefruit juice inhibits the metabolism of that drug, and you end up with levels in your blood that are too high and become dangerous. So the ideal drug doesn't interact much with either foods or other drugs. And then, of course, the drug company wants to be able to make the drug very easily. In other words, the synthesis is simple, and that each batch looks like the previous batch, and that obviously is good for both the patient because you know what you're getting, and good for the company because their profit margin is larger. So all these things are likely going to read into the approval of the regulators, and that really defines a good drug, and I hope we find one of those soon for PKD. Therapy also informs the clinical study design, and I'll be getting to the practicalities of study design soon, but there are multiple approaches, and these depend on how your drug is going after a particular disease. So let's talk about PKD. We know that cysts have cells that divide too much. In other words, they proliferate. So one approach is drugs that inhibit proliferation, or anti-proliferatives. We also know that cysts grow because the cells that line the cysts that are proliferating secrete fluid into the cyst, and it's like blowing up a balloon with water. Basically, think of them as water balloons. And so anti-secretory drugs are a possibility. There are also obviously the proteins that are mutated in the disease, the polycystins, and there may be drugs that can actually make up for the mutation in the protein and make it function more like the normal protein. These are all very different approaches, and they're likely going to result in different trial designs. And then we get to really what's going on that's pretty exciting these days, and that is targeted therapies. In other words, you have a problem in your kidney, you don't want your drug going to the brain where it might have side effects. So you can make biological missiles with warheads, and these missiles are targeted to the kidney specifically where they release their warhead, so they prevent proliferation in the kidney, but they don't stop proliferation in your intestines. And these would get rid of some of the side effects of anti-proliferative agents, where when they're used in cancer, your hair might fall out or you have GI upset, because these are two places where cells do proliferate normally, and you wouldn't want to target them if you were able to avoid it. And then there are microRNAs. These are small pieces of genetic information that are translated from DNA. I won't get into this. This could be the subject of another webinar or an expert that knows more about it than I do. But these are proving to be potential new drugs. They're not chemicals. They're actually biological materials that the body makes, and there's some very promising work going on. And then many of you have heard about CRISPR, and we've talked about CRISPR. This is gene editing, where one can take a cell from your skin, replace the defective gene in PKD, grow that cell, and inject it back into the body. We're talking, it's not science fiction, but it's in the future, and it's very exciting. And all of these, we hope, are kidney-specific strategies. So why is it so hard in PKD? Why don't we have a therapy on the market? Well, number one, I'm confident that that will happen, but most PKD strategies require long-term dosing. And this isn't just PKD, it's many chronic kidney diseases that take decades to reach end-stage renal disease. So the FDA and EMA and other regulatory agencies are concerned about giving a drug potentially for decades, although this is obviously done, that people take lipid-lowering drugs for decades, people take antihypertensive drugs for decades, but nevertheless, it requires many, many years to be certain that taking drugs for those long periods of time are going to be safe. And then there's the pace of enrollment. We're a rare disease, but a fairly common rare disease. That's ADPKD. ARPKD is truly a rare disease. So enrolling is difficult, and that's why I'm encouraging everybody who could participate in the clinical trial to really consider it. And then there are regulatory concerns. Will the apparent benefit that you see in the short term really prevent or delay the need for dialysis or transplant? Obviously, that takes a long time to determine. That's not absolutely necessary to approve a drug, but ultimately, that's what one would like to see. And also, over time, will the benefit-risk equation remain the same? In other words, most drugs are studied for 6 months to 2 years in the pivotal trials. What will happen after 10 years? And there are examples, unfortunately, where drugs looked perfectly safe in a 2-year trial, but when they were used for 6 or 10 years or longer, that they showed unwanted side effects. And then, of course, are the patient concerns. Will the therapeutic really be effective? For example, and I think this would be the case in PKD2, you don't wake up in the morning if you have high blood pressure and say, oh, I feel pretty good, maybe I don't have high blood pressure today, I won't take my drug. Well, the fact of the matter is, except in extreme circumstances, you don't feel high blood pressure. And many of the days in early PKD, you may not feel that you have the disease at all. I know that was the case for me. In my 20s, I had no idea, and I had no symptoms that were relatable to my disease. And will the therapeutic be tolerable? Some people, will take a drug and they have GI upset or some other issue. They decide not to take it. That is likely to lead to an ineffective drug, even though if you took it as prescribed, it probably would have been effective. And then, can I really afford this drug for the next couple of decades? That's always an issue, and that, unfortunately, is often a political issue. So I wanted to mention a little bit about ARPKD because this involves pediatric clinical trials. And actually, pediatrics among the drug companies is an area that they typically want to stay away from because obviously nobody wants to unwittingly harm a child. So the FDA, recognizing the need for drugs for children, has actually offered drug companies a 6-month extension of their patent, which can mean a lot of money in sales, for their willingness to conduct studies in pediatrics. Now, obviously, birth control pills or drugs for the treatment of diseases in the elderly will not have pediatric studies, but I would anticipate that PKD drugs, whether they be for ADPKD or ARPKD, could be studied in children. And children are defined as people under the age of 18, so informed consent becomes an issue that has to be provided for the parents. There are risks that are unique to children that are not risks in adults, and the children are still growing, so companies, in order to do these trials, have to be able to specifically show in animal studies, usually in rats and mice, that these drugs do not affect bone growth and they do not affect specific organs that are growing specifically during the years equivalent to a child's age. And they also have to be shown not to affect reproductive maturity. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to establish a drug as being safe to study in children. And children are also not merely small adults. I think all the parents listening have come to realize that probably earlier than later. But from a scientific perspective, children don't metabolize drugs the same way that adults do in many cases. So you have to be able to characterize how the drug is handled by children. A dose that's perfectly safe in an adult may result in either too high a blood level or sometimes too low a blood level in children because their livers may be more active in metabolizing the drug or slower in metabolizing the drug. And then tolerability issues will obviously be a lot different. Below a certain age, pills are no longer practical. The drug probably has to be administered by a dropper. Can the drug actually be made soluble? So there are a whole lot of issues, but the FDA is really trying to encourage drug companies to encourage the study of drugs in children. And then finally, for ARPKD specifically, the liver is often affected early on, where this is typically not the case in ADPKD, and because the liver is the prime organ for metabolizing drugs, this has to be taken into account as well. And then ARPKD is truly a rare disease, not a common rare disease like ADPKD. So it's difficult to conduct these trials and find patients, and more importantly, patients whose parents are willing to place them in clinical trials for this disease. So there are a lot of questions, and a lot of them are catch-22 type of questions. The other area where drug companies typically shy away from are drugs for women of childbearing potential, particularly for drugs expressly intended for women who are pregnant. Again, because of the risks that you could harm not only the mother, but you could harm the fetus as well. Nevertheless, the FDA wants to see these drugs studied, and there are drug companies that are willing to undertake the challenges in developing drugs for women of childbearing potential. It's difficult, but it can be done. And even though the FDA is conservative on these issues, they're more than willing to work for the needs of both children and women of childbearing potential. So I mentioned I'd tell you a little bit more about the phases. I think you know what phase 1 is. This is really testing a dose that's usually 1/10 to 1/100th of a safe dose in a mouse or a rat. It's often just a single dose just to see what happens? Is it tolerated? And then in the normal subject, bloods are taken rather frequently to see how long the drug remains in your bloodstream. This is called pharmacokinetics. And those same blood samples are used to see what is the drug broken down into. These are called metabolites. Metabolites are sometimes active, in other words, they're drugs themselves, and other times they're just chemicals that the body needs to get rid of, either through the GI tract or the urinary tract. And also, this is the one time when the FDA actually wants you to push the dose. They want to know, for future reference, what is the highest tolerated dose, and that's what the college kids get paid for, frankly. You're really scrutinized so that these the maximum tolerated dose is not an extremely toxic dose. By maximum tolerated here, I mean unacceptable headaches or unacceptable GI upset, those sorts of things. And then going further, those doses will probably never be used again. So in phase 2, based on knowing what the maximum tolerated dose is, you go into patients and you look at dose ranging. You want to find what is really the Goldilocks dose that's not so high that it causes adverse effects, but not so low that it isn't optimally effective. And that's done again through pharmacokinetics and something called pharmacodynamics, where you relate blood levels to the actual clinical effect. In other words, what blood level is really optimal to produce the effect that you're looking for. Once you've figured out what that dose is, you move on to phase 3. These are the pivotal trials. These are the most expensive trials. And typically for a common disease like arthritis or high blood pressure, you have to do 2 of these studies to get approval. And they usually have one primary endpoint. In the case of high blood pressure, it's lowering your average blood pressure by, let's say, 6 millimeters of mercury. You either achieve that goal or you don't achieve that goal. And that's the basis for approval. With rare diseases, it's sometimes very difficult to recruit patients, so you may only do one phase 3 trial. In some cases, and for some indications like cancer, it may be that the phase 2 trials are sufficient to market the drug with the agreement that the company will continue to study the drug going forward. And these are the so-called phase 4 studies, where you meet those regulatory obligations to continue study of the drug, look at long-term safety evaluation, and for the drug companies, look for possible new indications. So I've compared standard drug development to orphan drug development, and you can see that the number of patients studied in orphan diseases or rare diseases are very much fewer than are studied in common diseases. This leads to a little more risk, but also potentially a lot more benefit. And the FDA works hand in hand with drug companies willing to study orphan drugs because the patient population is not large. So the prices of these drugs tend to be very expensive because really, even though it's a small population that you're treating, it's just about as expensive to develop an orphan drug as it is to develop a drug for a more common disease. So you see that in phase 3, in a standard drug, you may be looking for thousands of patients, but in a rare disease, you're looking at hundreds of patients, sometimes much less. It may be 40 patients. There are some diseases where there are only a couple hundred patients in the entire world that have that particular disease. And fortunately, there are drug companies devoted to rare disease research that are willing to study these difficult diseases. So we finally get to protocols. Maybe I should have started the talk with protocols, but this is an outline, and when I say simple, I mean I'm showing you on one slide what is part of perhaps a 50 or 60 page document, which is the protocol that lists all the fine print, all the footnotes, and believe me, there are many of them. The design of a protocol by a drug company takes months and months and back and forth with the institutions that the studies are going to be conducted. But in essence, what you're doing is you come in as a volunteer for the study and you're assessed for your eligibility. And there may be 3 pages of fine print on how you decide if a patient is eligible or not eligible. You may be eligible and then take a blood test and find out that you're not eligible because one of your phosphorus level was too high or your cholesterol is too high. But if you pass all those criteria for being acceptable, you become randomized, and that is you're either allocated to the group that receives the intervention, and I've been talking about drugs most of this time, but it could also be an intervention. It could be a surgical procedure, it could be a device that you're attached to, but in any case, you either receive the active treatment or you receive the placebo. And I think you're all familiar with placebo. In the case of a pill, the 2 pills that are used, one the placebo, one the active, actually look alike so that neither the doctor or the patient really knows whether they're getting the active drug or the placebo. And this goes on with follow-up, and just a plug for participating in studies. You may have a nephrologist that may not have treated a lot of PKD patients. If you happen to be in a PKD trial, you're going to get a lot of attention from nephrologists that know a lot about PKD. So your medical care is free, it's frequent, and it's a good learning experience. And you learn more about your disease and what are the possibilities for future treatments. But this is essentially the design. Randomization, double-blind, and this is the basis on which drugs are developed. And it's all in the details. I've listed a protocol synopsis template. This is, I think, from University of California, San Francisco. I'm not sure, but they basically all follow a similar outline. And believe me, this is all on one page, but when you fill out each of these particular categories, inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, concomitant medications and therapies, the actual design of the protocol, when do you get the drug, when is your blood drawn, all those sorts of things gets to be a very complicated document. And of course you actually have to include literature references, your analysis plan, so the statisticians have to get involved. It's a complicated deal. And the better the protocol, the more likely you're going to get a definitive answer on whether you've got a good drug that deserves to be marketed or a drug that doesn't meet the standard for approval. So each potential participant obviously is unique. It's not like the white mice that we use that are bred to be very much similar to one another. You are all unique, and you have your unique blood values, physical attributes, and so forth. So obviously you may be initially selected, as I mentioned, but you could have an abnormal lab value or an incompatible medical history. The investigator may determine because of your work obligations that you may not be compliant for the study and may not show up for a blood draw. You may think, oh, it's okay, I'll miss one blood draw, but missing values are a big deal to the FDA. So this isn't to say anything about, your mental health or anything, but they want to be sure that if they enroll you, that you're going to comply with the protocol. And then some of you may start the study, and it's clear after the first dose, you, for whatever reasons that are unique to you, just don't tolerate the drug, and you'll be asked to get off the study. So, and then there are other things in the fine print that once you're interviewed for the study also may have to do with whether you're selected or not. So I'm not going to go into this slide, but these studies are typically not done by drug companies per se. They hire companies to do these studies, and they're typically done at teaching medical schools and universities. And you can see what's done on site, what the review process is, Actually, the one interesting thing that I haven't talked about is what does the FDA require to get a clinical trial started? Well, you submit an investigational new drug application, and the FDA has 30 days to either comment on it or say nothing. And believe it or not, this is the one time when you hear nothing from the FDA, you don't have to call them and say, hey, what's going on? If it's been 30 days, it means you're cleared to start the trial. So timelines, I've shown this slide previously. You can see all the time, 3 to 6 years it takes to get to that first dose in that first human subject, and that the clinical development takes typically 6 to 7 years, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer. Approval is supposed to take place within a year, but if the FDA asks you for more information, it may take longer. And then you're studying the drug essentially for the rest of that drug's life. So this slide also shows that there are a lot of compounds that are considered for candidate new drugs, but really only one in less than 1,000, more likely 1 in 10,000, ever really make it to the market. And then there are, of course, the regulators who the FDA might not say anything to in response to your IND, but believe me, drug companies are missing the boat if they don't take advantage of all the boxes in green, and these are opportunities to talk to the FDA. And talking to the FDA is very important because you don't want to find out 3 years later that they said you should have done something in that early study and now you have to do it all over again. So frequent communication with the FDA, although very stressful for the drug company, is an important thing to do. And perhaps the marketing application submission, which is often done in the form of a public forum where people can attend and see how FDA scientists and physicians that the FDA invites question the applicant or the drug company about the data on their new drug. So what are the alternatives for particularly rare diseases? And the NIH will often support the study of rare diseases, but I've highlighted philanthropy and new foundation programs, and that's important. The Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was key in developing the drug by Vertex, however expensive it is, that was the first one of the first specific therapies for cystic fibrosis. There were earlier ones, but not as effective. So we rely on your support to encourage startup companies and virtual companies to get interested in PKD. So the future for PKD therapies, I want to let you know, I was just at a meeting that the foundation funded with the FDA, EMA, Health Canada, and other regulatory authorities on how to design PKD trials. And multiple targets are in range. We discussed some of these, the biologicals, the small molecules, the anti-proliferatives, the anti-secretories, and so forth. And what was exciting about this meeting was that there were 7 drug companies that sent representatives. That's 7 companies that have 7 potentially new therapies in PKD that they're excited enough about as companies that they wanted to hear what the FDA and the European regulatory authorities had to say about PKD. So if you're thinking about joining a clinical trial, I'm hoping that some of these 7 companies will soon have clinical trials to test their lead candidates. At least that's my hope. And I was excited that there were that many companies. I really didn't expect to see them that showed up for this meeting. So the regulatory hurdles still persist. There's the issues of chronic use, which we've talked about. There's the issue of surrogate endpoints. In other words, you don't want to take your drug in your 20s and wait until you're in your 50s, 60s, or 70s, or hopefully never at the time that you need either a transplant or end-stage or dialysis, because we're hoping that these therapies are going to prevent the need for dialysis or transplant. So that involves the use of surrogate endpoints, and that was discussed at this meeting as well. Then there are pharmacoeconomics, and that's the cost-benefit analysis. I think we can make a compelling case to the U.S. government that PKD is responsible for maybe 8 to 10% of patients on dialysis. Dialysis costs the U.S. about $80 billion a year, so maybe $8 billion of that is due to PKD. So a new drug clearly would save Medicare a lot of money. And the quality of life clearly would be improved so that people off dialysis can work, and that means more taxpayers. And when you're advocating with your congressperson, that's a point to make. We'll save Medicare money and we'll be paying tax dollars. So I think in the near term, my hope is that we'll see drugs approved and maybe several drugs approved. So just as some people with high blood pressure take more than one medication, that may be the case for PKD. But the hope is to go after cures and not just treatments. And I think with the exciting new technologies and molecular genetics, that may be in our future as well. So how can you help? I hope this talk has encouraged you to consider being a volunteer in a clinical trial. And I should also add, some of these are just dietary trials. They ask you to eat a specific diet that may be low in protein or high in fish protein but low in mammal protein. And you can see that we have our own program, Accelerating Treatments to Patients, where you can find out about studies.
And I'm going to put a couple of links into the chat box that will direct you to the page on our website where you can actually see studies that are recruiting right now. And I'll also put a link where you can sign up for our ACT Alert emails that will let you know when there's a new study in your area that you might be interested in learning more about. So I'll put those in the chat box in the next few minutes here.
And so this is really the pay it forward zone. At a minimum, you're going to get good medical care in a clinical trial. And hopefully you'll be one of those that made it possible to have an effective new treatment hit the market. So I'm open for questions. I realized I've talked a lot longer than I thought I would. I also want to show you that on our website you can find these YouTube videos. There's a short version and a long version. These are both doctors and patients talking about clinical trials. And there's also an interesting fast draw on a whiteboard YouTube video that you can watch as well that will give you patient perspectives, particularly patients who have participated in clinical trials. And I think you'll find that they find a lot of benefit in being able to participate. So with that, I'll stop and answer any questions.
Okay, so here's one that just came in. So we are going to try and focus on the study design process for the questions. There are a couple that have come through about particular or specific trials, and we might talk about those a little bit in theory, but let me take the ones that are coming in about design specific to what we're talking about today. So this is a good one. Do you know how long it generally takes to find out if you are going to be approved or denied to be part of a trial?
Generally, since the incentive for drug companies is to enroll as quickly as possible, but also enroll the appropriate patient. In other words, if the FDA sees that you had a cutoff at age 50 and there's a 51-year-old enrolled, it might not be the end of the world, but the FDA will take note of those sorts of things. So generally the screening process is probably a visit, and maybe you return once more, and they'll tell you whether or not you're eligible for the study. But it's generally pretty quick.
Okay, and I'm wondering, excuse me, David, if you don't mind quickly running through just the 5 trials that are currently happening and know which one. Well, there's a lot more than 5, but there are 5 interventional trials happening. Can you list those and then say which ones are recruiting and where they're recruiting? This is really putting him on the spot, too. I did not prepare him for this. I'll help you.
Let's see if I can remember them all.
I bet you can do it.
Number one is pioglitazone, and that is being studied in the Indianapolis area, and they're recruiting ARPKD patients there, and you can find out probably on a website what age criteria, what kidney function criteria are required to be in that study. They are very anxious to have you enroll. If you're willing to travel, you need not live in Indianapolis per se. Second study is a study in the Northeast. This is at the University of Maryland and Tufts University in Boston. And this is metformin, curiously a type 2 diabetes drug like pioglitazone, but one which operates by a very different mechanism. Both of these drugs have shown efficacy in animal models of PKD, and obviously they're very well studied drugs since they've been out on the market for a long time. So these are two interesting studies. A third is right here in the Kansas City area, and this is being done at the University of Kansas Medical Center by Dr. Yu, who has given a webinar in the not too distant past. And this is a study of niacinamide, which is actually a vitamin that has shown effects again on cyst growth in animals. And this study is actively enrolling. I believe that tolvaptan, which is Otsuka's drug, has recently concluded enrollment, but I'm not entirely positive that that reprise study, as it's called, is closed, but I believe that it is.
So they're currently doing the study now, but I don't think you can join at this point.
And then the final study, and I believe this study is recruiting nationally, but maybe not in your particular city, and that is a cadmium drug called KD019, tessivatinib, which is not going to be its marketed name. That's a so-called USAN name. And this study, I know, is being recruited in California and in the Northeast, but I'm not sure if it's being recruited in other sites. And that's a phase 2 study. So I think that I have all 5.
I think you do. The cadmium drug, my understanding is they're looking to potentially open new sites as well. So stay tuned to our website. I put that link in the thing. And we'll also put all these links in a follow-up email to you later this week, early next week, so that you have access to that. But I do believe they're looking at opening it on their site.
Yeah, and just there's a fine line between too many sites and not enough sites, because too many sites and you end up with a lot of variability. Too few sites and your enrollment doesn't increase as rapidly as you would like.
Okay, we're getting some other questions here now. Okay, this is a good one. Why is there an age limit for so many studies? And why is it that studies seem to be done on earlier stages of ADPKD?
That's the second half of that question is a very interesting one, because at least from my personal perspective, studying early in the disease is important, but the disease is often studied a bit later when it's easier to see differences in treatment. For example, early in ADPKD, your GFR or kidney function may be normal, so even a great drug may not show a difference in kidney function because your kidney function is still normal. Age limits are for a variety of reasons, many of which are that the older you are, the more likely you are to have what I refer to as comorbidities. In other words, you're going to have other diseases, and it will be complicated to interpret whether you're getting a drug effect or not because of the other illnesses you may have. But there are studies that recruit to a very old age. It depends, again, on the protocol design.
So, okay, we've got a couple good ones here. Let's try to get through the last three before we finish, about 5 minutes. So someone is saying that they are they're in a trial, the tolvaptan trial, and they're not asking about the trial specifically, but more that they know people who are in the same trial in other parts of the country or at other sites, and they're having different experiences. So, for example, this person is not allowed to see lab results, but other people at other study sites are. Can you explain why there are inconsistencies in the same study but at different sites?
I think that goes to the comment I just made about having too many sites because there is variability. It may be common practice at one site that lab results, whether you're in a clinical trial or you're just a patient, that they need made available to you. I can't, obviously, without knowing more about the specific sites, tell you those differences, but I would also add that although that sounds a bit perplexing, it doesn't really affect, based on the question, the outcome of the trial.
And I would say if you are particularly interested in seeing those, ask.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with asking, and ask them why you can't if they say no. Always be an advocate for yourself. If you want something, don't hesitate to ask.
They also may not, they may feel that you could unblind yourself if you were particularly knowledgeable about a particular lab result. That sometimes is the case where they don't tell you about specific results.
And maybe they'll tell you that if you ask.
And maybe they will.
Okay, someone is asking, okay, are there trials that you don't have to travel or you can work with your doctor for things like labs, diet, medications? There are a couple that you can do, like observational studies, right, that you can
Yes.
do, so maybe speak about those a bit.
So there are natural history studies in PKD. I'm probably going to participate in one of them. It's being conducted at the University of Chicago. I could have my blood drawn in Kansas City, and they could work with where I had my transplant to get my MRI images of my polycystic kidneys, and I could be a participant in the study without having to go to Chicago. They prefer that I go to Chicago because they know how they handle the blood sample and that sort of thing, but you're absolutely right. There are many observational studies and natural history studies of the disease that can be done from the comfort of your own home or your own private nephrologist or internist.
Mm-hmm. And you will find information about those on the website at that link I sent you as well. Just click the observational tab instead of the interventional tab. Okay, let's blow through these last two real quickly. Someone is asking if they should be concerned about privacy and how information is collected and shared.
That's a good question, and HIPAA, which is essentially the Patient Privacy Act that the government insists upon, and you'll see that when you visit most hospitals, although you'll be giving information that you'll be assured won't be shared, but you're giving out private information about yourself in an open space. It is your right to actually ask to be interviewed in a private space. So patient data are anonymized typically, so you don't know what a specific data point, what its origin is, that it's from you or not from you, unless it involves a safety signal. So, if there's an abnormal result that a patient needs to know about or a patient's physician needs to know about, they won't let you suffer, the potential consequences. There will be notification, but it will not be a matter of public disclosure.
Okay. And then the last one, I think I can almost answer. Someone's asking about the artificial kidney. So that would be considered a device. So we've talked a lot about drugs and compounds and things, but artificial kidney, and we heard about this at the National Convention last month, would be considered a device, but it also has to go through studies and trials.
Absolutely. So device studies are interesting in that what is the control group? Being double-blinded obviously doesn't apply to having an artificial kidney surgically implanted. In animals, sometimes studies are done where an interventional surgery is done in one group of animals and a sham operation is done in another group. That clearly is not something that would be done in human trials. So these fall under a special protocol assessment, and the FDA actually has special protocol assessments.
And I think what we learned at convention is that they are looking to start those trials in 2017, right? Do you remember that?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. Well, that is all the time. We've gone a little bit over time, and if you're still with us, thank you for hanging on. Thank you for your participation, for all your questions, and for just attending and listening in. If you need to reach out to us directly, you can email us at education@pkdcure.org, or you can email me directly at alexisd@pkdcure.org. I can get back to you. If you have ideas of other topics you'd like to hear about, please let me know. Otherwise, on behalf of everyone here at the Foundation, and certainly David and I, thanks so much for being here, and have a great day.